The history of these earliest contacts between English adventurers and the native populations of the coastal regions of the Americas is of interest because of the nature of the relationships, however tenuous, that were established.
The nature of their relationship was two-sided because when the English first came in contact with the natives, they had somewhat of an amiable relationship. But this would change quickly as the English intentions of colonization superseded any seemingly good relationship that they had with the English, which we'll see as we continue reading in the book Race in North America by Dr. Audrey Smedley.
Historians point out that in the first Roanoke Island expedition, the inhabitants not only approached the newcomers without any overt manifestation of fear or doubt, but actually welcomed them with open arms.
The first Roanoke Island expedition happened in the late 1500s, and this place is located just off the coastal area of North Carolina. And so the people living in that area at that time, they welcomed these new arrivals with open arms, right, according to this source.
The native peoples were described as very handsome and goodly people, and in their behavior as mannerly and civil as any of Europe. Throughout the 6 weeks of that first day, the Indians were hospitable. Their guests were entertained with all love and kindness. Most revealing was the report that we found the people most gentle, loving, and faithful, void of all guile and treason, and such as lived after the manner of the Golden Rule.
What is the Golden Rule? Treating others as you would want others to treat you, which is a great biblical principle for most cases, right? And so this is how the natives were described by the English in this earlier phase of their interactions.
The Indians brought food daily to the visitors. If there ever was a universal primordial reaction of fear towards strangers, the indigenous peoples of the Americas had never heard of it.
The natives feeding the strangers, right? Showing them some love, having no fear towards the strangers. This was all part of the initial contact with the English when the English had arrived. And so we have no problem here at all in the beginning. And so now the English, they had some scope of the land, of the environment, and also of the people. And then they ended up leaving their back to their homelands only to return again. But then this time when they returned, things would go a little bit different.
On the second Roanoke expedition, the Indians again came to the aid of the English.
Just as they did during the first encounter, right? Hey, happy to see you guys again. Welcome back, right? We'll take care of you and look out for you.
But when some of the English colonists began to help themselves to food in the fields and storage areas, to cross into Indian lands that were not open to them, and to generally ignore Indian rights and customs, the latter began to withdraw support.
Now the English began taking the natives' kindness for weakness, and the colonizer within them finally began to manifest, right? And when the natives caught wind to this, they started backing off, right? Which is exactly what they should have done.
Many even decided to flee from the strange ingrates who made such arrogant demands of them.
An ingrate is an ungrateful person, or a person who's entitled to things, right? Which is most definitely a character trait of the English conquerors, and they began to show it.
Ronald Sanders suggests that a division between two types of colonists was discernible on that expedition. Those on the one hand who were inclined to resort to force as soon as possible in the resolution of all problems with the Indians, and those on the other who clung to the ideals of gentleness and carefully cultivated friendship that had been advocated by humanists back in England. Ralph Lane, whom Raleigh had appointed governor of the colony, was a leader of the pro-force and violence contingent. It is not surprising that he, like Raleigh, had dealt with savages while doing military service in Ireland.
The savages were the Irish, which the English, for the most part, absolutely despised. And so recall that the Irish, they had similar customs to other tribal peoples, right, such as the Native Americans. And since Ralph and Raleigh had already dealt with the Irish in a forceful way, they wanted to approach the dealings with the native tribes in a similar way.
The earliest settlers at Jamestown, which became the first permanent English settlement in 1607, also found the Indians unexpectedly generous, kind, and curious, willing to enter into amiable trading relationships, teach the colonists what they needed to know to survive, and learn from them. According to Gary Nash, the Indians provided much-needed food for the colony in its early years, even though much of it was stolen by the settlers.
And stealing food would eventually become something small in comparison to the English coming through and stealing all the land, right? And so you can imagine feeding and taking care of people who would eventually go off to steal all your land, right? What type of people would possess character traits that would allow them to do such things? I know They're called colonizers, right? So we have to understand exactly who we're dealing with in this narrative.
The English were not the only ones to experience the initial warm hospitality of Indians. The Dutch, who settled a fur trading station in Albany in 1614, and the French, who had established relations with the Indians of Quebec and in the St. Lawrence River area, had all engaged in amicable relationships with the Indians and peacefully promoted trade.
Isn't that interesting? All of them had these experiences with the natives. And once again, understand who it is that we're talking about in this narrative, and you have to get to know their character in and out to see how they operated and to see the extent that they were willing to go in order to dominate people.
Thus, all the settlers had reason to form positive views of the Indians. Yet the English consistently distrusted the Indians, interpreting their generosity and friendliness as, potentially at least, trickery and deception.
And they probably felt that way because that's how the English were themselves, right? And they probably figured that the Indians were playing the same game that they were playing.
This distrust seems to reflect ambivalent feelings that were never resolved during the first years of colonization. Europeans simultaneously maintained two contradictory views of the Indians, which had been formed even before they sailed to the New World. On the other hand, there was a relatively benign and positive attitude inspired by the writings of Spanish travelers like Columbus and Giovanni de Verrazano, which depicted the Indians as civil, honest, uncorrupted, generous, and noble. This view was buttressed by the missionary zeal of some Puritans, whose stated objective was the eventual conversion of the natives and their assimilation into Christian society.
And here comes the missionaries with their zeal for the Lord, right? The story of colonization is never complete without mentioning the role of the missionaries trying to implant their ideas into the minds of the people.
Such conversions were indeed the genuine and sincere goal of many of the settlers, as Alden Vulcan has emphasized. It was also the view of those whose main purpose was trade or exploration to find a northwest passage to China. This benevolent view later came to be symbolized in the stereotypic phrase, the noble savage, an image that became more pronounced in the literature of philosophers and other intellectuals in Europe, particularly during the 18th century, than in the thoughts of the colonists.
The noble savage was supposed to be just one level above the regular savage, right? And so the noble savage is still a savage, but nonetheless a savage with just a little bit more potential.
It had some roots in some of the descriptions of and attitudes toward Indians held by many early missionaries beginning in the 16th century, particularly the Dominicans and Jesuits. It was a charitable and perhaps gratuitous apprehension of barbarous folk as being potentially moral beings, innocent and trustworthy and hungering for the word of the true God. Their conversion would provide a magnificent expansion of the Christian religion.
It would provide a magnificent expansion of getting this here in people's minds, right? The European invented depiction of Jesus that most people hundreds of years later still can't get out of their imagination.
The theological underpinnings of this perception of the indigenes was the unity of man under the fatherhood of a single God. On the other hand, the image of Indians as fearsome, brutish, and depraved also persisted in many English minds. These images, too, were based in part on the many reports of the early Portuguese and Spanish explorers that were unfavorable to the native populations. During the latter part of the 16th century, many pamphlets were published that were filled with portraits of the Indians as crafty, brutal, loathsome half-men with cannibalistic instincts.
Pamphlets filled with these depictions, right? And so this is going into the use of propaganda, which is an extremely powerful tool to persuade the opinions, thoughts, and the feelings of a society. And so, of course, these people were masters in its use to serve their purpose.
Bizarre and unexplainable customs, heinous practices, nakedness, lascivious behavior, uncleanliness, and bestiality also were said to characterize the Indians. Gary Nash, Howard Mumford Jones, and Nicholas Canny show few doubts about another source of the strong impulse on the part of the English settlers to accept the more negative image of the Indians, despite personal experiences of kindness and hospitality and pragmatic reasons for establishing friendships.
The English were not going to get buttered up and softened up by a positive imagery of the natives, right? They had a mission to do, and they were going to stick to it by any means necessary. I mean, these are the English that we're talking about. So, of course, they had a strong impulse to accept the more negative images of the natives.
Nash makes a telling point. He notes that when trade with the Indians was uppermost in English minds and their services were needed in the search for a northwest passage or for mineral wealth, the Indians were portrayed as primitive but winsome, as ignorant but receptive individuals. If treated kindly, they could be wooed and won to the advantages of trade and cooperation. But when permanent settlement became the primary English concern and land the object of desire, the image of the Indian as a hostile savage became ascendant in the English mind.
You better recognize who it is we're talking about. A group of people who were willing to go above and beyond and play the game however it needed to be played in order to get a win. And so hopefully this has helped you climb just one more rung on that ladder out of the pit to enter into the free world where life is much better and it makes more sense. And so I want to thank you for watching all the way until the end. My name is Brooklyn St. Michael, and I'll see you in the free world.